Well, it's another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike YouTubers, and thanks once more for tuning in to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, I do hope you're continuing to enjoy my content here on YouTube with regards to these old vintage race bikes, and in this particular case we are going to continue looking at some of those classics that we came across in the paddock during the 2019 racing season. And so I hope you will enjoy this latest selection from around the paddocks during 2019 in Volume 8. Now, this very first machine we're going to take a look at is Craig Dixon's quite nice CZ. Now, I'm not entirely sure as to which year of bike this is, but what actually drew me to this particular bike was that fancy configuration of the exhaust system, which goes up the side of the frame, over the top of the cylinder head, and then down the side of the motor. Now, in the past I've seen various configurations of these type of exhaust systems on these CZ or CZ race bikes, but this particular exhaust system certainly had me baffled, and I can only imagine it's just a special exhaust system tucked up to keep it out of harm's way with regards being hit by stones or other debris. But it's certainly an exhaust system that I'm not too familiar with on these CZ machines, but it certainly looks quite radical. But nevertheless, this is still quite a nice looking old classic, this CZ of Craig Dixon's. Next up we have, well, it's really a bit of self-indulgence on my part really, because this is my late friend Ian Robertson's lovely little Can-Am racer. Sadly, we lost Ian in 2019 to a tragic accident that was not motorcycle related, I may add. So I've just thought I would add one of Ian's lovely race bikes to this particular paddock video. Now, of course, this Can-Am is just one of the many bikes that Ian raced during the season. Ian loved this little Can-Am machine, which was very light and extremely quick around the racetracks, and Ian used this bike as a backup machine when he wasn't racing his old Yamahas. Now, of course, the bike isn't a 100% original machine, because Ian was forever adding parts and taking parts off to try and improve the handling and the characteristics of the bike, but nevertheless you can see that this is still a purposeful little two-stroke racer with that Rotax engine in the frame. Although if you own or have even raced one of these little Can-Am racers, you'll know exactly how quick these bikes can be on the track. Now, there's quite a substantial size of rear sprocket on Ian's little Can-Am, and this of course was done to get the gearing of the motor just right for the tight and twisty tracks here in Scotland. But they were very quick little race bikes, these Can-Ams, and with that Rotax disc valve fuel induction system, which was very unique, made these bikes very rapid, and of course also made the bikes very reliable when it came to the maintenance. And of course, if you're a regular viewer to my YouTube channel, you may have already seen this bike and Ian racing it in action in previous videos on my YouTube channel, so it's good to know that Ian's memory is still living on in his little race bike. So that's Ian Robertson's very nice Can-Am. Okay, this is another rare and unusual bike that I came across during 2015. This is Gary Britton's KTM 4-stroke machine with that big single cylinder 500cc Rotax engine. Now, at first glance, looking at this machine, you can almost guarantee that this is not an original KTM machine, although it just goes to show what you can do with a little bit of cash and some spare parts, and you can put together something that is reasonably reliable and make it into a good old vintage race bike. Now, once more, these bikes are powered, of course, by this big 500cc single cylinder 4-stroke Rotax motor. Although it has KTM on the side of the engine casings, this is essentially still an engine built by the Austrian Rotax company. A dry sump, of course, on this engine. The oil for the motor is housed in the front frame down tube, but this is a very big, heavy lump of a motor, but nevertheless it is ultra powerful and extremely reliable. Now, I'm not entirely sure if these are the proper forks for this particular KTM, but nevertheless, this is, of course, a hybrid motorcycle. It looks like it's just been made up from a collection of parts, but nevertheless, it's going to make a good race bike for someone to enjoy a day out. Next up, we're going to take a look at Grant Lyons 360 CZ. Now, this was a lovely looking little Czechoslovakian machine that I came across in the paddock, and I don't know an awful lot about this particular bike with regards the engine size or the particular year, but it was such a nice bike, and it caught my eye, and everything about this bike just looked absolutely correct on the day. But yet again, the chances are that this is not a fully original bike, as because many of these older CZ or CZs very seldom are original these days, with so many modifications getting done, including removal of the barrel fins that you see in this particular shot. And of course, if you were looking for a machine to take up vintage or classic racing, then these CZ bikes are a fantastic choice, because there is so many spare parts and upgrades available for these bikes these days, and they make a very good bike for taking up vintage or classic motocross. And this particular example of Grant's is a superb looking little bike, and I could actually see myself taking a run around the track on this wonderful looking machine. Although, as I said, if you were looking for a race bike to take up classic scrambling, then you couldn't do much better than grabbing yourself one of these old classic CZs. Okay, our next bike is another lovely looking CCM machine, and this is another one of the bikes I came across during 2019. Now, I don't know about the actual owner of the machine, but the bike certainly looks to me like it's a Joe Maxwell reproduction bike. This bike is certainly not an original CCM bike, but nevertheless another very good remanufactured machine from Joe Maxwell. Now, as you no doubt already know, original versions of these CCM bikes from the early 1970s are very hard to come by these days, and getting harder all the time, and it's thanks to the likes of Joe Maxwell, who can reproduce these old CCMs under license from Clue's competition machines, and it's good to keep the name of Alan Clues alive in these old vintage race bikes. A pair of rock shocks on this particular example, and of course the chrome plated frame, which of course these bikes had way back in the day. And of course these CCM bikes powered by that older BSA B50 motor that Alan Clues re-engineered way back in the 1970s and made these CCM bikes into a very potent 4-stroke racing machine. And you can see that our particular rider has fitted a pair of these bar risers to lift the handlebar ride height up ever so slightly. And also these CCMs of course had these very long legs at the front and plenty suspension travel to cope with any kind of bumpy racetrack. Also these footrest hangers were again bolted on to the side of the engine casings. But another very fine example of one of these reproduction Alan Clues CCM bikes. Okay, our next paddock bike is Andy Malloch's 414 Montesa Capra. Now, as opposed to the CCM that we've just seen, this is a fully original Montesa from back in the day, and this is a very quick little bike and a workhorse for Andy when he rides this on the racetrack. But you can see straight away that this is a well used old Spanish Montesa, and Andy tells me that this bike has only had one change of piston in its entire life, and the bike has more or less been 100% reliable. And this is a very quick little bike on the track, and Andy uses this Montesa in between racing his other two machines, which are of course his 4-stroke Armstrong bikes. But in terms of a bike's originality, they don't come much more original than this old warhorse of Andy's, and every part on this bike is more or less as it was when he first bought the bike way back in the day. And the only other thing that's been changed on this bike that I'm aware of are things like a change of tyres. But other than that, the exhaust and the seat, the plastics, the tank, the back wheels and all the other parts are as they were when Andy first bought the bike way back in the 1980s. But again, these Montesa 414 Capras are not the most popular bikes at classic and twin shock race events, but it's still good to see that riders are still putting the effort in to keep these old classics on the racetrack, where we can still see them all in racing action. So that's Andy Malloch's original Montesa 414 Capra. Okay, our next machine is we're going to take a look at Sam Sibbald's TT500 Yamaha. Now once again, this is not an original TT500 bike from a way back in the day, as this bike of Sam's has one or two non-original parts fitted. Now one of the parts on this bike that I do know is not original is this swing arm, and I'm sure, if my memory serves me correctly, Sam told me that this swing arm was from a Kawasaki, but that was a couple of years ago, so I may be wrong in that particular respect, but I do know that this is not a standard Yamaha swing arm. But if you like your 4-stroke vintage race bikes, then you'll love these TT500 motors, and as well. You know, these are very reliable and quite powerful big 4-stroke engines. Once you get them set and running correctly, these are fantastic big engines if you like this kind of motor in your old vintage race bike. But these Yamaha TT500s are based around the old Yamaha bike from the late 1970s, which of course was a type of enduro machine with lights front and rear and all the other associated parts that you needed for going on the road. But many of the riders tended to strip them down and make these into these fantastic and very quick 4-stroke race bikes. And if you're a regular viewer to my YouTube channel, you may have already seen Sam racing this bike in some of my racing videos. But nevertheless, it's an absolutely gorgeous looking 4-stroke scrambler. That's Sam Sibbald's beautiful TT500. Okay, just to finish this volume 8 version of In The Paddock from 2019, we're going to take a look at Stewart Riddell's beautiful 1969 250 twin port CZ. Now, Stewart actually bought this bike from another fellow classic racer many years ago, but the bike didn't look like this obviously when Stewart bought it. This was how the bike looked when Stewart first came to pick up the bike. Now, it's pretty fair to say that Stewart had some work to do on this old Czechoslovakian classic racer, but nevertheless Stewart spent a bit of time and money and has turned this into a lovely little classic racer. Now, these CZs of course had the single cylinder 2-stroke motor with the twin port exhausts, which of course went down either side of the bike. A very unique layout of a machine from 1969, and it's quite strange actually to think that anybody would put these low slung exhausts on a dirt bike where they could be easily damaged. But nevertheless, this is still a very quick and very nimble little 2-stroke machine. And you can also see that Stewart's kept the original Zhikov carburetor on his particular bike. Many owners of these CZs tend to ditch the old Zhikov carburetor and go for something like a Japanese Mikuni. But this was mainly because the old Zhikov carburetors were very prone to flooding, and many riders tended not to use these and opt for a more modern replacement. But some riders still use these old Zhikov carburetors, and when they're set up and running right, they can still do a fine job powering these little 2-stroke CZs. Now, this particular bike of Stewart still has all the original CZ parts, like these back plates and the proper forks, and Stewart maintains this bike to the very highest level, so it's a very reliable little machine. But these twin exhausts at the rear are certainly a sight to behold when you come up behind this bike if you are a fellow racer.